Welcome, everyone. This is the Culture in Progress podcast, where we talk about how American culture is evolving in the 21st century due to science, the economy, and broader social forces. My name's James Brohl, and my co-host is Patricia Patnode. And today we are fortunate enough to be joined by Lisa Thompson, who's Vice President of Research for the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. Welcome to the show, Lisa.
Thanks for having me.
We are going to be talking today about the recent scandal that involved the fashion design company Balenciaga and a controversial ad campaign that they produced. So to start, I'm going to turn things over to Patricia, and she's going to give some background on what happened with the company for those who aren't aware of it, and then we'll open it up for a conversation with Lisa. So take it away, Patricia.
Thanks, James. So just briefly, there was a campaign that featured children for their 2022-2023 collection. There was some BDSM gear that was featured on a teddy bear and a child standing in a bed, and it was very odd. And a lot of parents quickly became outraged online. There was coverage from every major media site and newspaper in America, and very quickly the brand backtracked and started cleaning house a little bit. They said they issued a statement. All the photographers involved issued various statements on Instagram. Kim Kardashian, who's pretty much the main ambassador for the brand, stated that she was reevaluating her relationship with them. So there was quickly a lot of outrage and backlash once people noticed the campaign, which is good and noticeable. Their creative director, Demena, D-E-M-N-A, is still their creative director, and he said that he did not realize the full context of the campaign. So there were images that showed children that people were concerned about, and then once people started digging into other images for the fashion line, there were some that had some very in the background of an image, there was a book that featured some very disturbing drawings of cannibalism and children that people were worried about. And then there were some conspiracies online about something involving Satanism that may or may not be solvent, or they might be just conspiracies that flew from just this being a very odd situation. And then there was court documents that was this case, Ashcroft versus Free Speech. That was about basically child pornography. So everyone was very, very up in arms and worried. So that just in a nutshell was the situation. People were upset, and Balenciaga did file a lawsuit that they dropped against the company that produced the images. So it is yet to be seen if there will be anything that comes of that, legally. As of now, nothing. It seems like nothing will happen except reputational damage. So that's pretty much the situation.
So, Lisa, what are we to make of all this? I mean, who is to blame here? Is it the company? Is this just some rogue photographer or set designer? What do you make of this whole situation?
I guess, James, I would say it's emblematic of a broader, long-term systemic problem that's been going on for decades. The sexualization of children isn't something that's a new phenomenon. It's been going on for literally decades. I was shocked to realize that as far back as the 1930s, there were films featuring a 3-year-old Shirley Temple and other toddlers that were very highly sexualized in nature. And these were broadcast, available, and anybody could go to movie theater and see these films in which these very sexualized scenes are played out involving 3-year-old and 4-year-old children. But then, fast forward, and, we have these momentary spurts of outrage fairly frequently over different child celebrities, oftentimes that get sexualized in the mainstream media. So for some of us who are older, we will think of Brooke Shields was very emblematic of that kind of sexualization of a young girl, and shown in very highly sexualized ways in advertising, and then of course in later films that she was in. You think Miley Cyrus is another great example of a child who was sexualized young. And then, of course, we know how sexualized, hypersexualized, pornified, you could say, she became in her career as an adult. Britney Spears, Beyonce Knowles, just on and on and on. The list goes of people who start out in kind of in these childhood stars, or they're in media, they're in fashion, they're performers. And it seems like we have a way as a society, particularly if they're girls, of really sexualizing them, and then oftentimes blaming them and hating them for it at the same time. But there's a huge demand for the sexualization of children. And with the Britney Spears example, I mean, she was on the cover of Rolling Stone in a bra with toys and on a bed, and there was outrage. People got mad. I'm glad they did. I'm glad that we're here now talking about the case with the Balenciaga. I can't really even say this word, their name, but I'm glad that there was outrage about those images. That shouldn't be normal. That shouldn't be accepted in our society, in our world. But what we need is sustained outrage. Like, we can't just have these momentary flashes in the pan and then we just all go on. And because the problem is just metastasizing, it's getting bigger and bigger. Children are just perpetually being sexualized. It's becoming more and more ingrained and part of the everyday fabric of our lives. So I think as a society, we've got to work on sustaining our outrage and getting very specific about specific ways to direct our attention and our energies to hold companies like this accountable, but also to attack the deeper roots of the problems.
Yeah, that kind of gets at a follow-up question I had, which is, I mean, if we're blaming society at large, are we taking any of the responsibility away from the particular individuals that were involved in this?
Oh, I think they're highly culpable. I think there should be some executive heads that roll within the parent company that owns the chain. It's just ridiculous that think of all the layers of people who had to be involved in the decision making about creating this ad campaign, thinking this was a good idea, creating the product of the bears, and who's deciding, the bears that are plush cute teddy bears that then you dress up in BDSM gear, and then somebody has the bright idea that, we're going to put little children in this, like toddler age children in these pictures, and won't that be so cool? Won't that be avant-garde and edgy, and won't we be chic? That's the mentality that we're dealing with. And part of that, so there is a very real corporate responsibility involved here for engaging in some, putting something forward that juxtapose children with something that's very sexualized and fetishized. But there's also a layer in which this is very emblematic of how we see society at large, the pornification of society, and how easy it is for people who are living in this pornified bubble, not a bubble, I mean, it's just the world has become pornified. And then how we begin to superimpose that pornified view on the world around us, how it comes out in various forms of expression, whether it's in an advertising campaign, whether it's in music videos that are produced. And that goes back, if you want to peel back that layer of the onion deeper, then we can get into things like, well, the consumption of adult hardcore pornography, which is something that's happening on a massive scale. And I mean, I'm not saying that everybody who consumes adult hardcore pornography is going to go out and make an ad campaign featuring children in BDSM, but there's an undeniable reality that people who are exposed to pornography over time get desensitized to that material. They are going to have to seek out different kinds, more novel, more exciting material in order to get the same personal gratification from using that material. And for a certain number of people, that's going to lead them down various roads to various extremes that exist in huge quantities on the internet now. Things that we never would have dreamed of 30 years ago are now just, blasé vanilla porn. And so for a certain number of the people who are consuming all this content, for some of them, it's going to be the sexualization of children. Like, oh, well, that girl looks really, that woman looks really young. So you start setting your sexual template in that direction. And then, oh, I really like this girl's look a little younger. That's more exciting. And before you know it, some of the users of this content are looking at young children. And so I'm not surprised in the least that we would see something like what we saw with this ad campaign. I mean, take for Netflix's Cuties film. You know, there was some outrage about that. I don't know if people are familiar with that film, but do you want to say something? Jump in, Patricia?
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, Netflix, they ended up taking it down because people are upset by how sexualized, like the children dancers, they were like basically like a dance troupe. And people became very upset, and they eventually took it down after saying that they were going to leave it up for.
They took it down?
Oh, I thought they
Wow.
did. Did they not?
I mean, I know there was some hue and cry about it. My understanding was that it's still available. So if it's down, I am ecstatic. That would be amazing news. but the fact that they even released the film, I mean, whether it's up or down, the fact that it was released, and the whole plot is about 11-year-old girls who get, you know, sucked into the sexualized culture and get involved in a dance troupe. And, you know, the girls coming from a more traditional culture, where they're much more conservative, they dress more conservatively, they have a religious faith, and then they're sucked into a dance troupe that's dancing, but, you know, kind of like stripper-esque, you know, like very a lot of hypersexualized dancing for 11-year-old girls. So even though, you know, Netflix has claimed that, oh, it's, you know, trying to or, you know, I think some of the people who were involved in producing the film are claiming, oh, well, it's really not about normalizing it, it's about combating it. But you can't combat the problem while basically glamorizing the problem, like putting it up for like all kinds of people to consume. And lots of people out there are going to be very thrilled that there's this whole new bunch of material for them to consume that they're going to be sexually gratified by seeing young girls dance in this way. So this stuff is all around us, and we have these flashes of outrage, but we've got to sustain our outrage and really create a movement of people who are dedicated to fighting the normalization of sexualization of children.
Oh, and just
I mean,
you were
is
right.
there-
It is. I was going to
Oh, go
say
ahead,
the
Patricia.
Cuties film is still up, but they removed it from like the search terms. They like manipulated their algorithm. So basically, unless you like specifically search for it and like the documentaries tab, you wouldn't come across it, which it's still on there, but it's not promoted with like all of the same tags. So it's still
Yeah.
there.
I can't believe they still have it up like that. To me, it's I mean, whatever you think about art, you know, the art of it or the storyline of it, the fact is children are still being sexualized in the storyline. And I don't see how you combat the problem that then you are actually emulating in the film. Like the children are totally being sexualized in these dances. So that's just another example.
I'm just wondering, I mean, is there any artistic defense either for Cuties or for the Balenciaga campaign? Is it possible it's just, in particular with Balenciaga, maybe it was just some kind of misunderstanding? Patricia mentioned some of these examples of Supreme Court files that were kind of surreptitiously inserted in a different ad campaign, and it's kind of questionable whether that was an accident or not. I mean, is it possible that there is some kind of defensible reason for this, or artistic or otherwise? Is it,
No.
or is that just not
I don't see
even in
how
the
you
equation?
could possibly defend it. And again, it's like you have to think about the layers of people who were involved in decision making. This wasn't, I can't imagine that one person just decided, oh, we're going to make BDSM fashion bears. I mean, that decision alone, I think, is bizarre and weird, and to me just points to the pornification of our society and how they're wanting to present themselves as edgy and trendy.
It's an adult product, right? The bag is for adults, or is it for children?
Yeah,
yeah,
presumably,
okay.
but I mean, it is a very child like product, a teddy bear, right? A cute teddy bear, but then you dress it up in, leather and fishnet and stuff like that, so that it, has that BDSM kink look that comes straight out of mainstream pornography. And then you do the really edgy thing and you juxtapose that with a child, right? So I can't imagine that was an accident. And if it was an accident, then clearly a lot of people are asleep at the wheel at that company, and people should be fired, period.
Yeah,
I mean, somebody's got to be responsible for it.
I will say the Kardashian West family, who I'm like casually like a fan of Kim. I think they're very interesting and I like the show. But Northwest and like the entire family, they do looks from Balenciaga a lot, and her children are shown in the looks that are from the like the Balenciaga campaigns that are inspired by like BDSM sex gear. Not like lingerie, but like the masks and like the leather looks. So like they are that line, and pieces from similar lines have been like shown on children, which is very odd and like raises a red flag. That's why I wasn't that surprised when I saw the Balenciaga campaign, because I've been following the Kardashians for so long, and that's where the brand has been like going for the past couple years. So that's very interesting.
Well,
So go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, I was gonna get into so it seems like we are now talking about children as like sexual beings, and like every person is a human, and like you go through puberty, like you have hormones, like presumably like that's the life course of a human. But so in the Netherlands and like the Dutch education model, which has been talked about a lot of the United States as a good model for how to communicate sex to children, is that they're introduced to these things and kind of the realities of life through educators by law at a very young age. And supposedly that is good for their development, and they're introduced to like masturbation and like all of these other different terms in elementary school and middle school. So then they have a large vocabulary and are able to navigate the world. To me, I feel like the United States is slowly moving in that direction and thinking about children as like sexual beings, legislating that type of education and encouraging it by law. Like we saw in New Jersey passed a law that they want basically the stuff to be taught to their middle schoolers. So is this Balenciaga campaign like just people noticing this societal shift that's also kind of being allowed by things that we're voting for and policies we're enacting, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, there's so many things happening here. You have the adultification of children. In other words, imbuing children with adult-like qualities, presenting them in ways that you would present an adult to be. You might see an adult. And then you also have the childification of adults. In other words, presenting adults as if they're children. And like, for instance, in mainstream pornography, this is a very common phenomenon now for mainstream pornography, women involved in producing pornography, to present themselves as children. This is something that's going on OnlyFans, even as we speak. There'll be women who are, trying to look like teenagers or babyfying themselves in order to draw more attention to themselves and get more subscribers to support their business model. One of the most famous and pornography performers in the world of recent date is a woman by the name of Belle Delphine, and that was her entire motif, was that she started as an Instagram poster as a teenage girl. She had a really interesting kind of genius way of presenting herself, as kind of combining different genres and themes that are common, like in what they call cosplay, costume play, and presenting herself in a very cute. I mean, she was a child, and so she's very coquettish, presenting herself in kind of sexy poses, and then she launches herself when she becomes 18 and she goes out there, and one of her first films, her first pornography that she produces is her having sex with a man in a teddy bear costume. And she looks, again, dressed up in a very childified way, having sex with a teddy bear costume. And then I think the next one was she's dressed again, very childified, innocent looking, and then she's abducted and raped in the woods. So this is one of the most famous pornography performers that in the world. I mean, she's kind of going on and off the internet, so it's kind of erratic, her presence, but she is garnering huge amounts of attention, huge following on OnlyFans, and she is providing content that normalizes the idea of having sex with children and sexually abusing children. And now you can't expect that you're going to have millions of people consuming that content, and it's not going to influence some of their decision, some percentage of them, their decision to act out in that way. And I mean, for anybody who's consuming pornography, I think they need to think about, there's, considerable body of research that shows that over time, pornography is going to influence your attitudes and behaviors. And what people need to understand is that porn users shape culture. You can't imbibe this content and expect that for decade upon decade and expect it's not going to color your attitudes and your behaviors towards other people, particularly towards women who are depicted in objectified and demeaning ways in pornography. There's now there's common practice of choking as a mainstream sexual practice, and that just like happened almost seems like almost overnight that became a norm, but that's straight out of the influences of pornography, and it's seeping its way into the actual sexual behaviors of people today. And girls are like shocked that guys are trying to choke them all the time. But that's what they've imbibed from pornography and what they have been taught that girls want. So, I mean, it's all, there's a lot of different layers here, but, in terms of Balenciaga, I think there's definite corporate responsibility that needs to happen. They should institute some policies, child protection policies at the corporate level, that if they're ever involving children in the production of their ads, that they're going to have standards about how those, what happens to those children on set, what kind of ads that they're produced in, that they're not sexualized in any way. That's at their corporate level. And then if we broaden it back out, like just what could policymakers do? Well, countries around the world, people who are involved in legislators could, work together to, within their countries, establish guidelines for the advertising industry, for the fashion industry, for any kind of, industry, film production, in terms of the involvement of children. How are they going to be portrayed? Not permitting them to be portrayed in highly sexualized ways, and making sure that they're not abused while in being essentially used in some way in the production of whatever content that they're creating. So there policymakers could work to create standards in that way. Then if you want to go even bigger, I really think we need to be looking at as a society, reassessing, taking stock of our embrace of hardcore adult pornography. One of my main points here is that mainstream adult pornography is not a harmless medium. And that what we're seeing when we see ads like the Balenciaga ads is seeping into what we call the mainstream world. And if you look around you, the mainstream world more and more looks like the porn world. It looks like the pornography industry's vision of reality more and more, because you have so many people consuming it, and then they begin to express it all around them, and it bleeds out into the mainstream. So like when I was a kid, you never would have dreamed of seeing something, a brand doing an ad campaign like what we've just seen. But within the decades since I was growing up, we had the internet come out, and we had so much, the pornography industry migrated and got on the internet, and then we didn't have good regulation of the internet. We had our country, our legislators, I give them credit, they tried. repeatedly to pass laws to protect children from exposure to hardcore content online. And over, those laws, a piece would get overturned here, or a law would get overturned there by this court or that court, sometimes the Supreme Court. And we've been left so hamstrung as a country in our ability to regulate and protect children from content online. So like the Communications Decency Act, Section 230 is the prima facie case of why everybody who's working in the child protection space is just like running around with their hair on fire. Like, we've been trying so long, crying out so long that children are being damaged and harmed by exposure to this kind of content online. And we can't hardly do anything about it because of this law that was passed in 1996 and a series of, really tragic court decisions, which have completely, in our opinion, missed the whole point of the law. So that's an example of where we need major policy shift, is in correcting Section 230 of the CDA. And there's been attempts at that repeatedly, and we've made a dent in that recently by passing some legislation known as FOSTA SESTA. But then there's also issues like enforcement of our existing federal obscenity laws. I mean, I don't think the average, if you polled 1,000 Americans, maybe would 1 in 1,000 even know that we have federal obscenity laws that by which we can prosecute people who distribute hardcore pornography, that much of the content that we're seeing that's available on the internet could actually be prosecuted if Department of Justice ever decided to do its job and enforce the laws that have been passed by the Congress of our country. But they just decide not to. I mean, what power, when you can just this prosecutorial discretion to not enforce laws. That's what they're doing. And what we're seeing with the explosion of child sexual abuse material and the pornification of our world is precisely the result, the fruit of their decision to not prosecute adult hardcore material.
Yeah, I think I'm hesitant to say that like altering Section 230 would solve the issue. But I think that's just like a difference in policy opinion on that. But I think you're very absolutely correct in that there are a lot of laws that people choose to not enforce, and standards that we don't hold, that like the public doesn't hold companies to, because we don't have like a huge interest, which is maybe that's like fine or not fine. But yeah, it was with obscenity laws, like if like a child sees something like that's a crime. Like it's a crime to like show a child, there's to show a child porn, like it's on purpose. Like there are a lot of things that states could do like within the legal framework that we have. And even with like there's a child actor, like there are child actor protections. Like I think those could be extended to children that are posting content online, so their parents are more responsible and involved and liable for if they are setting themselves up. And like a very I know so many, like when I was a teenager, I followed a lot of other teenagers who were famous that were unfortunately like setting themselves up to enter what in my view is unfortunate, to enter like the adult film world. Like I think her name's like Bad Baby, the girl who got famous on Dr. Phil, immediately entered like the porn market following her 18th birthday and was setting herself up to that. She was a minor at the time. I thought it was very strange that there was no intervention there with the content that she was producing online, and like what was happening in that county, like what is happening with like our ability to protect children when they are doing things that like other authorities have a vested interest in protecting them from themselves and protecting them from like bad parenting. So yeah, James, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely wonder if one of the reasons why, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of laws already being broken as far as underage imagery of people online, or just revenge porn, things like that. And so it just seems to me that ultimately it's going to have to be some kind of cultural shift in order to change this. I mean, if we could pass a law and it would get rid of a lot of this stuff, then that would be pretty desirable, but I just wonder if this is evidence that the legal system alone is not enough. And then I wonder, like, where does the cultural shift begin? Does it begin with people like Kim Kardashian? Does she have any culpability in any of this, just being associated with the company, or how do we even start that process?
Well, I mean, there's a few things I wanted to mention here. I think you're completely right that the legal system, legal responses are not enough, and our people have tried multiple times to pass various laws, and to some extent, some of them work, and to others, like, as I've already mentioned, they'll, like, the Communications Decency Act has had a long and tortured history, and it has tragically shielded the very people who should be held liable, the large big tech companies who are allowing a lot of this stuff to metastasize on their mainstream platforms, and when they have so much power and capacity to cut it off and to deal with it, and they're just choosing not to. But in terms of dealing with it, like, I know I don't want to throw the law enforcement community under the bus. Like, there's a huge amount of people who are involved in fighting online child sexual materials, and dedicating tons of people hours and resources, and doing very, very hard work to try to catch the individuals who are consuming this content. But they're never going to be able to keep up. Like, at this time, there's an absolute tsunami of this of material. For instance, like, as far back as when they started collecting reports, tallying this information back in 1998, there were 3,000 reports of child sexual abuse material. In 2018, there were 18.4 million reports of child sexual abuse material. So how could we possibly expect our law enforcement community to have the capacity to deal with that? And there were, within those just 18.4 million reports, there were over 45 million images and videos flagged as child sexual abuse material. So they have a staggering problem that they're dealing with. But what my point is that their decision to not prosecute the adult hardcore content that could easily be prosecuted. And people often argue, oh, it's not easy to bring these cases. Like, I work with people who prosecuted those cases and won every single case. Like, 14 cases, no losses. One of my coworkers, prosecuting obscenity. I also the president of our organization headed the child exploitation and obscenity section at DOJ, brought numerous prosecutions against people who were distributing hardcore adult content, and put pornographers all over the country in jail. And they were really having a big impact. But we had a shift of a couple things that happened. We had the internet came along, and the internet and the pornography industry migrated onto the internet. And then we had a shift of priorities at the Department of Justice that said, oh, we're not going to prosecute this anymore. We're only going to go after the child content. Well, where has that led us? To a problem that we cannot even begin to contain. And that's because they're treating the wrong end of the problem. You have to get upstream. And the upstream is the adult content that, as I mentioned earlier, people will be consuming, they'll get desensitized, and they're going to, many of them will escalate to hardcore content. And for some of them, that's going to take them down the CSAM path. Not everybody, but some people will go down that path. And I mean, you just open, if you put a Google alert on your email and put in like child offender, sex offender, and just see, you can find story after story every day of guys who said, oh, I never thought I would do this. This is not who I thought I was. And, coaches and teachers and professors who are getting arrested for child sexual abuse content. This is not something they weren't born with a desire to, as pedophiles who desire, they didn't have an innate desire to have sex with children. It was something that their consumption of pornography groomed them to eventually want. And then the other thing I don't think I've mentioned, I want to throw out there before, because I know we've been talking a while, is how pornography is actually acting as a super groomer of children. Because we talked about how much they're getting exposed to this content. We've kind of alluded to it. Like, it's so easy for them to access on their phones. There's so little we've just kind of left the barn door open for over a decade without adequate filters and controls. And so children have been exposed from very young ages to very extreme and hardcore content. And that has left many of them struggling with compulsive sexual behaviors that they can't begin to control. And for many of them, like they're just wrestling for years to overcome their compulsive pornography use. But so that leads me to some, like an example of something we're working on that is a policy response, which is what we're calling the device filter bill, which is the idea that when a child is given a device that has internet capability, that filters need to be turned on automatically on that device for a child. If it's an adult device, then there's ways you can toggle off those filters, but any child should automatically receive a device that has filters turned on so they're not exposed to this kind of content. I mean, we wouldn't take children and sit them in the middle of a XXX store, right? Everybody would say, oh, that's terrible. We should never do that. That's abusive to do that. But yet we hand them a device that's basically a global sex store with every kind of things that people have never even conceived of being possible in terms of the extremes of sex acts that are done in hardcore adult pornography, and children have full access to these devices and easily are going to get sucked into that world. So the device filter bills, which we're working on, the first was passed in the state of Utah, and we're working to get it passed in a few more states. We have to get, I think, like five more states to pass it before it will actually go into effect. But that's an example of a policy measure that we're hoping people will get behind to help us protect children. But I think to your broader question about creating a cultural change, we need people to question their pornography use. Adults need to question their consumption of adult hardcore material. Is it making them a better person? Does it make them think more lovingly and kindly and behave more nicely towards other people? Has it led them to consume types of pornography that before they would have thought were disgusting, revolting, or unethical? Like, and if you can't answer those questions like in a way that's like, oh yeah, that's made me a great person, and oh yeah, I've never consumed that other stuff. I've just only looked at this kind. Like, people can't say that. I've very few people could ever say that. So I think we need to, as a culture, need to reassess the normalization of adult hardcore content, and really need to have a reckoning with and recognizing that our adults' consumption of adult hardcore pornography, it has consequences. It's not some benign thing that doesn't influence or impact other people. It creates a demand for more content. And that demand is going to result in more and more people getting sucked into the pornography industry. It's going to result in more and more children being used in the production of content to meet the demand for people who've gone down that very dark hole and decided that that their sexual desires and their sexual wants are the most important thing, and it doesn't matter if children get harmed in order to meet their needs. So all this to say that there's so many different layers of there's a huge elephant in the room, and we all need to be taking our own bite out of it. You can kind of start at different places. You can start with Balenciaga. You can start with, oh, I'm not going to buy their brand, or I'm going to push them to institute some protections and create their own child protection policy, or I'm going to work to hold these industries accountable on a large scale and create standards, or I'm going to really go to the roots and I'm going to deal with the monster that's really feeding all this, which is the adult hardcore pornography industry.
Just so we wrap up on maybe a somewhat positive note, I mean, is there reason to hope, given the backlash that we saw to this Balenciaga campaign? You think maybe we've turned a tide, or is this just a one-off thing?
I mean, I definitely think there's always reason to hope, and we're seeing, positive things happening. I mean, with the Balenciaga, it's encouraging. I mean, anytime I see people responding to this normalization that's been going around us, and then they're pushing back on it, that's a very encouraging sign that not everybody has been lulled into complacency and acceptance of the unacceptable. But the thing, like I mentioned earlier, is that tragically, that response is usually very short term. It's not a sustained outrage. And we need people to get a fire in their gut to say that we are so tired and we're fed up with industries and people, using our children as sexual consumables and portraying them in that way, and creating us, because like what the Balenciaga ad did was just add fuel to the fire. I mean, I've talked about how many images are out there, how many children does it, you've got 18.4 million reports. That's, granted, there could be multiple children in those reports, or maybe sometimes more children as in one child is, it's hard to know exactly how many children would be implicated in that, but potentially millions of children are reflected in that statistic of, individual children being harmed. And why would any corporation decide that they would put something out there that would contribute to the idea that children are acceptable sex objects of sexual desire for adults? And that's just precisely what they've done. They've set back the interest of every child in the world with an ad campaign like that. It's not, not just the individual children involved. I mean, I actually think those individual children could be haunted the rest of their lives, the ones who were in the images, by people who saw them. They're going to grow up like, oh, you were that kid. And there's going to be, I promise you that there will be pedophiles out there who will be using that content to sexually gratify themselves, even though they weren't, explicit as actual explicit child, sexual abuse material. There are people who will, desire any kind of sexualization of children, and they will use that content for their sexual gratification, put it in their collection. So I kind of lost my train of thought there, but it's all back to the hope. So I do think there's hope. There is a movement of people who are working to hold the tech industry accountable, hold the pornography industry accountable, who are speaking out against the normalization of the sexualization of children. But we need a lot more people. Like it's been like rolling a boulder up a mountain, like a massive boulder up a mountain. And it feels like it's just been a relatively small number of us over the years. But I do see that growing. I do see more and more parents getting concerned. And I think this generation, this young adult generation is, coming into adulthood, they're becoming parents. They know what happened to them in their teen years when they were, given access to the internet without filters, and they got exposed to all this garbage, and they maybe made their own images and sent them, and the collateral damage that can come from all that, they've experienced it. So I think for a certain number of people, there's the beginnings of an awakening to the harm. But we need to harness that. We need to, galvanize more of it. We need to create more of it, more awareness. We need to get more people on board with efforts to push back against all this.
And so where can people learn more about you and about your organization?
Yeah, well, we're the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, as you mentioned. We've been working on these issues since 1962. And so we just celebrated our 60th anniversary. You can learn more about us at endsexualexploitation.org. We have a very active law center, which is currently engaged in litigation against both entities in the tech sector and big actors in the pornography industry, like Pornhub. We have a very active public policy shop, which is working on things like I just mentioned, like the device filter bill. and many other initiatives as well. But so yeah, definitely come on to our website, check that out. I almost forgot, like our corporate advocacy. I mean, it's kind of astonishing. We have really robust and active public push to hold corporations accountable, to try to work with them to clean up their act, to stop the dissemination, of all this content that's so harmful to children, and create really to think about safety before, like to design safe, to have the safety of their consumers, particularly of children, in mind before they release all these new apps and programs. And so not just have it be some afterthought that happens 12 years after their product has been out. Some like really be intentional about how is this going to impact all the users of our product. So corporate policy, public policy, litigation. We're also active in the research front, trying, exposing, helping people to understand more about the harms of pornography, to make that research understandable to the average person, and to get that information out there. There's just mountains of it that's just, people don't have time to dig into all these in-depth studies. So we're trying to do our part to get that the science is on our side, and we're just trying to help people find it and understand it. So you can check out the research on our website as well. So EndSexualExploitation.org, National Center of Exploitation.
Lisa Thompson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great talking with you.
Great talking with you too.